And so the fact that people don't talk about the concerns or the struggles that they face during pregnancy does not take it away. What it really does is that it makes the symptoms worse. And so for some of them, they're able to cope. Maybe because they have support from their husbands, or they just have that natural resilience to deal with this. Now, again, I need to state that the fact that a person is not able to cope doesn't make them weak. So my name is Abojei. I'm a clinical psychologist and a psychotherapist. I'm actually happy to talk about mental health and pregnancy. So I think first I need us to understand how common mental health is. Not just with pregnancy. Mental health is quite common. In fact, I say to people that every one of us have mental health, but it's the illness or the disorder that might actually vary. Statistics actually puts it at 1 in 4. And so if you look at that, you realize that regardless of whether or not you're pregnant, 1 in 4 persons would experience a mental health issue. And if we count 1, 2, 3, 4, it begins to help us see how common this is. But when we extend this to pregnancy, what I would like us to look at is how pregnancy affects mental health and how common it is as well. Just like I stated that 1 in 4 people or persons would experience a mental health issue, a similar statistics actually applies to pregnancy. Very recently, it was identified that 25% of pregnant women would experience a mental health issue during pregnancy and even afterwards. But then the question is, why don't we see this as common? So I think first I would look at what are the symptoms that pregnant women experience, and how does it affect them. So when a person gets pregnant, you notice first is the excitement, depending on the situation, right? Because some people don't get excited. Some people, especially those who don't want it or who are not expecting it. But let's talk about a situation where this particular lady or woman is expecting the pregnancy and has been looking for it. And so there's that excitement about it. Oh, I'm excited, I'm pregnant. But with the excitement also comes some changes, a lot of changes, a lot of physiological changes. For the woman, the moment you get pregnant, your body starts to prepare you for delivery and for being able to cater for your child. And so what would have looked like a survival instinct or a protection from your body or a preparation stage or phase from your body begins to usher some chemical imbalances. And then with these chemical imbalances also comes with mood changes as well. And one of the very common thing that you find out with pregnant women is that they get really sensitive, really sensitive. And sensitivity at that point means they could interpret things a little bit differently than they would have. And this interpretation might then lead to some level of distress. But in addition to these changes that they experience, you would also notice that the body doesn't just affect the mind directly. It affects itself. That's the whole body. So this lady could start to put on weight. There's probably an increased craving for food. Increased craving for food would mean that if I'm eating more, I should put on more weight. And so when things like this start to happen to pregnant women, for some of them, it's quite difficult to accept. It's quite difficult to accept. So imagine that I used to be a size 8 or a size 9, and now I'm pregnant, and my size starts to increase. I start to notice that I start to add a little flesh here and there. For some women, that's a concern, and especially for married women, some of them start to ask questions about, am I still beautiful? Does my husband still love me? Will he still love me? And for some other people, sex could also be a problem. And so questions around that, am I able to satisfy him? And so if you look at the focus or the theme of this set of questions, initially there might be questions around how people perceive them or their ability to play their role adequately. And so just like anybody, when you start to perceive that you are inadequate, either in fulfilling your role as a wife or fulfilling your role as a person, that has a huge pressure on your mental health. And maybe to help you understand this pressure, we'll look at one mental health issue, which is depression. We believe that depression usually could be as a result of three things. We call this the cognitive triangle. That's the way you perceive yourself, the way you perceive others, and the way you perceive your future. And so when you look at this, when a person starts to have negative perception of themselves, negative perception of the future or of others, that is likely to lead them to experiencing depression. And so if we take this example or take this analogy and go back to pregnancy, you realize that the pregnant woman could have this affected. Like I mentioned, when your body starts to change, then you now feel, oh, am I able to adequately fulfill my role? Am I good enough? Am I good enough for my husband? And then anxiety questions like, would I be a good mother? Am I able to cater for my child well? How, all those questions start to come up. And these are void of the other social issues that might come into play. Now, when you look at the stages of pregnancy as well, you look at the first stage, which in our part of the world and maybe generally is usually built around secrecy. The average Nigerian for the first 3 months will not want to tell anybody. Why? Because they are not sure yet, and they want to be sure about this before they start spreading the news. And so maybe the only person they talk to is their husband. And husbands are excited, right? And again, this is an assumption depending on the type of pregnancy and if it's something that this person wants. So they're excited, they're all excited. But with that, secrecy means that you can't share some other things. And some things that you might even want to share, your husband might not understand, right? Your husband might not understand. But because you can't share with people who have gone through that same phase or that same stage, you are left to deal with it yourself. And being left to deal with these things yourself, of course, leads to pressure for some of them. There's that pressure. And so all the thoughts goes on in their mind. Am I beautiful enough? Now, for people who are even close to their husbands, they might go ahead to share some of these concerns with their husbands. So, okay, am I adding weight? Am I fat? And then that is where, we then need support from the spouse. So if the spouse is able to provide that support and reassure them that, no, babe, you're looking fine. Don't worry, it's just a phase. But you need to also understand that no matter how you try to reassure them, assure your wife or assure your spouse of how good looking she is or how she is at that point, or the fact that she's not inadequate, it won't take away that. It won't take away the thoughts. But at least it makes it easier for her to cope. Right? It makes it easier for her to cope. Now, for some women who then start to experience, in fact, the first stages or first trimester comes with its own symptoms as well, depending on the individual, because our bodies react differently. So for some people, it comes with some nausea, vomiting, some level of discomfort as well. Some women begin to fall sick around that period. And so all this discomfort and all these physiological changes are a pressure for women to cope with, for pregnant women to cope with. But again, like I said, they don't have that support. Now, something that I've also found out in my experience talking to pregnant women and then even nursing mothers is that at that stage, when they remember the tales that were told by their parents or their mothers, there seemed not to be a correlation. And that's because when the average African mother or the average woman shares her birthing experience, and that's why, they share it from a positive perspective. And so let me use my own mother, for example. When she shares my birthing experience, she talks about how awesome it was, how stressless it was and all that. And when you start to think about that, and then, for example, let's assume you have that kind of mother and then you get pregnant, but you are not experiencing all this stresslessness or ease that they've talked about, it then starts to make you feel like, oh, is there something wrong with me? And so the perception of weakness could also restrict people from sharing their experiences, because I don't want to share my experience and you say, it looks like you're the first, because every woman who has been pregnant, some people even say, oh, you're not the first person now. So this person had 6, or this person had 3, or this person had 2, and they were able to cope with it. So why are you complaining about this? And the problem here is that even those who had 2 or had 6 or had 5, all had experiences or challenges or issues around their pregnancy, but they did not share because they wanted to appear like they were strong. And that's a major problem, because now when a person gets pregnant, they've heard a lot of tales about how strong their mother was or how strong people are when they're pregnant, and they want to appear that way as well. And so they tend to keep all these things to themselves. Unfortunately, the fact that they don't share these things, the fact that they feel like they are alone, the fact that they feel like, you know what, this is strange and this is just happening to me, also has its effect on their mental health. And that's why you find out that during this period, there is an increase in mental health issues, anxiety, for example, depression, for example, and for some other people who have had any history of a mental health issue like bipolar. Now, unfortunately, these are quite silent at that point for some people, for some women or most women. So they have complaints like this, but they don't share, and they don't make it look like a big deal. I had an experience to talk to a group of mothers, expecting mothers at some point, and during the antenatal, what I noticed is that all the antenatal period sessions, they will talk about physical issues, talk about how to care for your child. Nobody really talked about the psychological distress these women were going through. And in one of the sessions, I think I talked about the fact that, women would go through some changes, psychological distress. And then when I mentioned this, I noticed that a lot of them started saying, yes, I'm experiencing this, or I experienced this, or I felt low, or I felt that. And it looked like it was a general thing, because everyone had a story to share. And what that made me understand is that even though it's not talked about a lot, it's a concern, right? It's a concern. The mood changes are a major concern. The fear that they experience, not just the fear of caring for their child, or will I be able to take care of this child, also the fear of what would happen to me. And I can remember that personally, towards the delivery period for my wife, she had to share some of those things. She was concerned about what would happen, would I die? And she would constantly tell me, are you praying? Are you praying? Are you praying? And I would say, yes, I'm praying. But it was almost like you're not praying hard enough. But I understood that, the reason why she's having this concern is a normal fear that what would happen to me. Some of them might not share. They might not talk about this, but it's there. Right? And so the fact that people don't talk about the concerns or the struggles that they face during pregnancy does not take it away. What it really does is that it makes the symptoms worse. And so for some of them, they're able to cope. Maybe because they have support from their husbands, or they just have that natural resilience to deal with this. Now, again, I need to state that the fact that a person is not able to cope doesn't make them weak. Right? It doesn't make them weak. It doesn't make them less than all the others, right? But yes, some people are not able to cope, while some are able to cope with all these changes. And then it comes to the point of delivery for some of them. Not everybody has a smooth, uneventful delivery. Some of them might actually experience a lot of difficulties, not just the difficulties now. If you've ever had a woman describe the pain of childbirth, you understand how it is. Well, you might not fully understand actually, but I heard someone describe it as next to being burnt. So it's the pain they experience is next to being burnt. So imagine if someone is set on fire, and the pain this person would go through. Then imagine that's what every woman who is delivering or going through the delivery process is going through. Then it begins to help you understand why some of them might even have a mental health breakdown. And maybe to help us understand this better, I'll just go back a little bit to talk about mental health and how people can develop mental health issues. So, what is mental health? By way of summarizing, WHO would define mental health as an individual's ability or a state of wellness or well-being where an individual is able to cope with the normal stresses of life, is able to be productive, give back to their environment, and be fruitful. So if you look at that, it begins to help you understand that this is common, right? But I like to look at it more from a perspective of your ability to think, your ability to feel, and your ability to react or behave in certain situations. And then when you look at that, the question then is, how do people experience a mental health breakdown, remember that I've mentioned that we all have mental health, just like we all have physical health. But how do people develop a mental health breakdown? And one thing that we would always say is that there are different factors. It could be biological. That means some people could have genetic predisposition to this, maybe because somewhere along the lineage somebody had this and then passed it on through the genes. And so for some people, it could be as a result of psychological issues. So a person had low self-esteem growing up, or a person does not probably, doesn't know how to cope well with stress. And then also what we call the social issues. Those are stressors, life challenges, challenges like losing a job, challenges like, not being able to find your house rent, or even work challenges, or working with a difficult boss. Now, these are challenges that could lead to a mental health breakdown, and we call these things stressors or triggers. Now, when you look at all these things, you realize that pregnancy and the difficulty in pregnancy, or the stages and the experiences that women go through in pregnancy, could be a major trigger for most of them. It could be a major trigger for most of them. And that's why when you look at the statistics, you'll see how common it is. When I say 1 in 4 would experience a mental health issue. Now, it might not be severe enough for us to become alarmed, right? But it could be just something mild, it could be something moderate, and in some cases it could be severe. But what the statistics actually does is that it helps us see how common it is. Right? It helps us see how common it is. So yes, you can be looking at, so if you count 4 pregnant women, 1 out of those 4 is going through a challenge. And if you look at how common it is, it helps us understand why we need to pay attention to this. And so when I talked about the pain of delivery, then I think you begin to understand why that alone could become a trigger for some of them. Why that alone could become a trigger for some women. And then that's when we start talking about postpartum mental health issues, like postpartum depression, which is very common. Some people call this depending on the severity, call this the baby blues. Now, every woman, or most women, just because I don't want to overgeneralize, right? But most women would report having that low mood after delivery. Yes, again, comes down to how ready they are to share. Some of them don't want to share because there's that expectation that you just gave birth now, why should you be sad? And because they don't want to disappoint us, they don't want to look like, oh, I'm ungrateful that I gave birth and all that, they are smiling. And yes, no doubt, there's that joy of having to deliver safely. That joy comes in. But just after that, there's that baby blues that come in, where they start to feel sad, and they start to feel, and that's where the question of, can I do this? Can I take care of my child? Those questions start to come into their mind. And then those periods, you would also notice that statements start to get to them. They become hypersensitive. Another reason why this is happening is because, just like I mentioned, that when you get pregnant, your body starts to prepare you for it. Hormones are secreted, chemicals are secreted, and your body is trying to prepare you for the stage of pregnancy. When you give birth as well, there's also that biological adjustment. So it's almost like your body is trying to go back to what it used to be. And so during that phase as well, there's a likelihood that a nursing mother, a woman who just gave birth, experiences some mood or mood issues around that period. And so little statements or things that people will consider little statements start to get to them. So for example, a person could just make, or an in-law could just make a statement like, the baby doesn't look like his father, or it looks more like you. And that becomes a problem, because she then starts thinking about the fact that, oh, are you trying to say that I cheated? Or are you trying to say, but she might not share all these things, right? But what this does is that it affects our mood. Why? Because our mind starts to look at all the possible negative angles that you are coming from. And again, it's not intentional. It's because at that point, the body is trying to regulate the chemicals, trying to regulate the hormones, trying to regulate the neurotransmitters, and that leads to the mood disturbance or issues that this woman might experience. Like I also talked about the expectations as well, and that anxiety comes in. Now, for women who experience difficulties giving birth, either they've gone through a surgery or they have complications with their child, it becomes more. Why? Because like I said, this is a trigger, this is a stressor. And this stressor can affect them in different ways. And so, yes, this makes us understand why mental health issues in pregnancy and even after delivery are very common, and why we need to pay attention to them. The other thing then is, so how do we help pregnant women, expecting mothers, and nursing mothers? How do we help them? Because if we understand that this is common, right? If we understand that this is common, and if we understand that it's not a thing of weakness, or it's not a thing of how weak you are, it's a general thing that could affect anybody, then we need to start focusing our mind to saying, how can we help these people? Now, one way that I've found out that can help nursing mothers, pregnant women, expecting mothers, is support. The biggest thing they want to understand at that point is that they want to feel understood. They want to feel like they are not alone. And that's why you find that it is easier for an expecting mother to cope with these stressors when they have somebody there to help them, someone there to support them, especially when they have a supporting husband. It's easier for them to cope with these stressors. Now, I'm going to talk about something really soon, and that's the place of the spouse as well, and the mental health challenges that spouse also, that's the men also go through. Now, if I say that, if I mention that mental health issues amongst pregnant women is not often talked about, I would also say that when you look at the probability of talking about mental health issues amongst men when their wife is expecting, it should be almost zero. No one wants to talk about it, because people don't really know that even men go through stress as well around that period. Now, in my experience and studies, I found that men go through a lot of anxiety when their wives are pregnant. Anxiety about, for some men, will I be a good father? So for some men, can I afford the bills? For some men, can I take care of them? For some men, what if something goes wrong? So they have all this going on in their head, but just like we would say, men are not expected to show weakness, or men are not expected to cry. And like I mentioned, because of the expectations, because of the questions of, can I do this? Would I be a good father? Can I provide? And then the need to wanting to become a perfect husband at that point, or meet all the needs, could also lead to some pressures, and of course could trigger mental health challenges at that point. Unfortunately, so you realize that on both ends, one feels like, I can't talk about it because I don't want to stress the other person. The other one feels, if I talk about it, it will mean that I'm weak. So you find this going on in our mind. So if you look at the picture, you'd see a picture where one person has a lot of stress, or going through a lot of things at that point, but they can't talk about it because they feel like the other person will not understand. Now, the other person, that's the other spouse, is also going through a similar challenges. They're going through similar challenges. So in our heads, you have a lot of questions. In this other person's head, a lot of questions, but no one is talking about it. So one of the ways that I think we can help is if we can talk about the challenges that we're going through around our period. If we can talk about the questions, the concerns that we have, right? It would be a way to express what we call catharsis. And what this simply means that it helps you let out pent-up emotions. So if we can sit down and say, wifey, I'm afraid, without feeling that if I share this, you would think I'm weak or I'm not a man, right? And if the wife can say, you're afraid, I'm also scared. Or I feel like I'm not beautiful enough. And then he can say, don't say that. You are looking beautiful. Yes, you might have added a few weight. Because yes, it also pays to be honest, so they don't feel like you're just trying to bamboozle them or something. But the first way that I think that we can start to help ourselves during the whole pregnancy experience, and when I say ourselves, I'm not just talking about the pregnant woman, I'm talking about the spouse as well, because the effect is not just on the woman, on the pregnant woman, it's also on the spouse, is to share your experience. Talk about this, right? Talk about this. In my own experience, when my wife was pregnant, I made sure that we try to talk about this from time to time. And I'll say to her, I'm anxious, I'm afraid. Initially, she would say, why are you afraid, right? Initially, she didn't understand all that. It was after we gave birth, and that may be because of this is my profession, and I've been able to see all the demands that will come up. And so I was thinking about all the demands. And yes, I was able to, I think one thing that helped me was that I did a personality assessment again. I did my personality assessment again. And I was lucky that when I was looking at my profile again, I saw in my profile that people with my profile are good fathers, are good parents. And I told myself, okay, you'll be a good parent. And that was enough reassurance for me, right? But after we gave birth and I shared with her, and she started seeing all the anxiety that I was talking about and said, okay, this is why you were saying this. And I was like, yes, that's why I was saying this. But sharing helped us deal with it. Right, the times when she had concerns about her looks, had concerns about if she was adding weight, and I'll tell her, don't worry, you're so beautiful, you're still beautiful. She will say, I know that I've added weight. You're just telling me so I can feel good. But we're honest with each other and we're able to share our experiences. So when I'm afraid, I share with her. And so I feel that one way that couples can help themselves through this phase is being able to share. Right. The second thing that I think we can do is being able to support each other. When I talked about spouses, and that's the husbands having challenges but not being able to share it, I found out that some of them begin to engage in coping mechanisms that are maladaptive. So you can find this person begin to spend more time outside when that's not what they should be doing. And so the spouse then feels, that's the wife then feels like, she's being neglected at that point. And that could also be a major trigger. Or it starts to, for some of them, probably having increased sex or sex desires, start to go outside. All these things has its toll on the mental health of the wife. But if they were able to sit down and discuss the challenges that they were facing, it would have been easier for them to solve it. So I think the first thing you need to do, instead of engaging in some of these maladaptive behaviors or maladaptive coping, so maladaptive here means that they are not positive. They are behaviors that do not promote your well-being. That's what it really means. So instead of engaging in some of these behaviors, being able to share your experience is one way to start the healing process or start the coping or the support process. The other thing is being educated, right? Getting education about what to expect. And if you notice that what a lot of women would say when they share their birthing experience is that they would say, no one told me this, right? I never expected that this would happen. And so I feel that the second thing that we need to do is get enlightened, right? Read about it, read about mental health issues in pregnancy, not just mental health issues, even the physical issues. So what is likely to happen? And I would also say that it's important that we are less religious when we talk about these things. Yes, we don't expect negative things to happen to us, but some people just tell themselves, oh, God forbid, and they rule it out without preparing for it. So you would see some women who go for antenatal and there are signs, but they keep on saying, oh, I have faith. But if they were able to, accept some of these things and prepare for them, maybe some medical routines or some physical or lifestyle changes, if they're able to do some of these things, it probably would have helped, maybe not totally, but a great deal. So I think that education is very important, right? I would also say this, and this is something that I think this comes down to the hospitals. When you go for a typical antenatal care in this part of the world or in Nigeria, the questions that the doctor would usually ask is that they'll ask questions around your physical health. Is the baby kicking? Are you eating? They check your weight. They check all those basic physiological signs. But nobody would ask you, at least from my experience and interacting with some of them, very few of them would ask you, how are you feeling? Right? And I think that if we can incorporate three major questions here, which is, do you feel depressed? Do you feel like you're experiencing a low mood? Do you feel down? Do you feel hopeless? Questions like this. Or do you still enjoy the things you used to do before? Do you feel like ending it all? Do you feel that this is a difficult time for you? If we can incorporate some of these questions in our antenatal care, it also gives us a heads on in being able to pick up some of these warning signs, and you can identify that, oh, this person is going through a challenge. And like I said, support from the spouse. That means that when the expecting mother goes for antenatal care, she shouldn't go alone. She should go with her husband as well. right? Why? Because there are some things that the husband might have noticed that she doesn't want to share. And I know that this experience I had with my wife, that sometimes when we go for antenatal together, and we've identified that, oh, you are having this challenge, A, B, C. We get to the doctor, and the doctor asks us, everything is fine, everything is fine. I said, no, everything is not fine. This happened. Right? So what do you say about it? Why? Because it becomes easier for you to share as the spouse because you've noticed it. And sometimes it's not because they don't want to share, but because they feel that, and I heard this from my wife, she would say that is not out of place. It's something that every other person goes through. But it's important that when we talk about this, we help them understand that, see, you are not weak because you are experiencing this. And so I think being able to incorporate this in the antenatal care is very important. I know that most hospitals have weekly or maybe monthly antenatal clinics where they have women come together, more like a support group, and then nurses get to teach them, midwives get to teach them things about delivery. So I also think that if we incorporate mental health checks as well, right? So having a process where every woman who comes for antenatal has to, take a simple test, maybe a simple depression screening test, would help us identify mental health issues early enough to deal with them. So yes, I've mentioned sharing, I've mentioned support. I've also mentioned education, getting enough education about this. I've talked about incorporating this in mental health care in the antenatal clinics, from the gynecologist to the monthly sessions with the midwives. Incorporating this is very, very important. I also would talk about educating the general public, especially relatives. Why? Because some women would say that one difficult or one challenge that they face after they give birth or during pregnancy comes from their in-laws, right? Prior to when you get pregnant, to when you are pregnant, some in-laws will come and say, you are going to give birth to a boy, and it might not just be a boy, but what this does is that even though it's not a problem for their spouse, for the husband, but it becomes a pressure for them, because now they're feeling like, oh, if I give birth to a female, would it mean that it's not acceptable? And that becomes a concern for them. They start to think about it. It becomes a concern for them. Sometimes when they even come to take care of the woman after delivery, they might begin to exert some unnecessary pressures. And so educating them about the process of childbirth, educating them about the mental health challenges. Now, the good thing about educating the family is that, especially the women, right, they would be able to relate. Right? And so when you can educate them and say, oh, yes, I felt this way. Now, you don't just educate them, you also equip them to provide support so that they don't just come in and create pressure. They are also able to provide support. I would also say this, and I think this is something that we are already incorporating in this part of the world, where we can space visits, right? We can space visits after you've given birth. And this is because if you don't do that, if you have both families come to stay with you to take care of the child, you would get a lot of pressures from both families. And instead of you resting, what that will lead to is that it will lead to increased pressure and more susceptibility to a mental health breakdown. And so educating family members is very key, and I think one way to do that is just educate the public. And programs like this actually do that. You educate the public about the pressures of pregnancy and delivery, and help them understand that, see, it's not out of place for a woman to experience anxiety, for example. It's not out of place for a woman to experience depression, for example. It's not out of place. I also would say that in case you then notice that for a woman who is pregnant or after delivery, you notice that you're not doing well, I don't think it's out of place for you to reach out for professional help. It's very important that you reach out for professional help. And that's because most mental health issues can be managed adequately if attended to early enough. And so we need to be able to identify the warning signs, right? And so maybe the next thing I'll talk about is, what are the warning signs, right? How do you identify that I might be going through a mental health challenge? So there are two broad ways that I'll look at it. One is that I'll look at a before and after, right? A before and after. And so what does this mean? Is looking at yourself before and looking at yourself now and say, okay, naturally or before now, if a person makes a statement like this, how would I naturally react, right? And so if you realize that, oh, before now, if you had made a statement like this, I probably would not have a problem with it. But now I have a problem with it. That means here that you can just be experiencing, you might just be experiencing some level of hypersensitivity at that point. And that could just be an indication that you are probably struggling and you need to get help. Or you just need to pay more attention to your health or more attention to your mental health. So look at the before and after. Look at how much you take care of yourself. And so pregnancy should not be a period where you neglect yourself. It should be a period where you can also nurture yourself. You can also take care of yourself. You can make yourself feel good, right? So look at the before and look at the after. Then you can also look at some of the other symptoms, like, for example, what is my mood like consistently? Do I feel sad? Do I feel hopeless? Do I feel like ending it all? Do I wish that this is not happening to me? Do I feel like I can't take this anymore? So thoughts like that or feelings like that could just be an indication that you probably need to talk to a professional or you need to get help. And so for spouses as well, when you look at your wife as well, and you probably notice that you're having more communication problems, you're having more challenges communicating with each other, more emotional outburst from your partner. That could also be an indication that they need help. And this goes vice versa. So you see that your husband is experiencing more emotional outbursts, getting angry. We've had cases of how nursing mothers did something to their spouse, or expecting mothers did something to their spouse. And yes, and people don't understand what is happening. But it's important that we know that during this period, it's a challenging time for most of them. It's a challenging period for most expecting mothers and even for nursing mothers. And so we must be able to offer that empathy when we relate with them. So empathy is very key. Identifying the signs, the warning signs. For some people would say that I'm beginning to hear voices. And this is for people who experience postpartum psychosis, where they hear things that others cannot hear, or they see things that others cannot see. Before now, we would say that the people who consider this as spiritual attack. They'll say, and I've also heard people say that it's this person is, there's a popular word they use, Obanje, in Nigeria, Emiri, that's for the Yorubas, or I think, for the Yorubas, that when the woman starts to say, I'm hearing things that, and a lot of people are looking around and say, what are you hearing? We can't hear it. Or a mommy water. Some people would even say that this person has had the covenant that when they are giving birth, this thing should happen. And I've had experiences like that with relatives even, where people would say that. And so my first experience was when I was a kid, when I heard someone say that, his wife was experiencing this, and everybody in the family gathered and said, she's a strong marine spirit and all that. But it took being a professional to come to understand that, this was not it. It was just a mental health breakdown. And like I've explained, that this could have just been as a result of the stress that she was going through at that point. It could even be as a result of a genetic predisposition. That means there's something in her genes that a code, a mental illness code. It could just be psychosis or schizophrenia. But if we're able to understand that this is not spiritual, we're able to pay more attention to it. And you would even find out how easy it is to deal with some of these things. Something as simple as taking medication. So I would say to some people that when you have malaria, what do? You go get medication and you take it and you're fine. And the same way you get, and you are not concerned that, but I had malaria 3 months ago now. You don't have a problem with that. You go take your medication. If a person has high blood pressure, they go to the doctor, they prescribe to them, and they take their medication and they're fine. In fact, illnesses like high blood pressure are chronic, just like mental health. And what we mean by chronic, it doesn't mean that it is big. It just means that you need to manage it for a longer time. And that has to do with mental health issues as well. that when we are experiencing mental health issues during pregnancy or after pregnancy, what we just need to do is get the needed help. Speaking to a professional. Sometimes it could just be as simple as getting medication. Sometimes it could just be talking to a professional who is able to take you through psychotherapy. And in psychotherapy, what you'll be learning is that you'll be learning ways to deal with the challenges that you're going through. I like to say to people that what psychotherapy really does is that it brings you to become more aware of yourself. So self-awareness. Why? Because if you've noticed that some people don't even know what's happening to them. So they don't even know, and a lot of times people think that this is wrong or something is wrong. When clients come to me, I notice that the biggest challenge they really have is not the illness. It's the perception of severity of the illness. They think that this is really big. I have a real problem. And I've also noticed that once I'm able to reassure them, once I'm able to help them see that, this is not as big as you see. And I usually call that normalization. When you are able to normalize the situation, they are better able to or better prepared to cope with it. And so psychotherapy helps people become more self-aware. Not just becoming self-aware, it also teaches them skills to cope adequately with the challenges they are going through. And so it's something that I would recommend for every expecting mother, every nursing mother. We should be able to, put this in our system where we're able to get that professional help. And while we talk about professional help, I also will talk about support groups. Now, this is something that is not too common and popular in this part of the world, but having a support group where nursing mothers can come together and share their experiences. I've had experiences with some clinics who have groups like this, but what I've also noticed that a lot of times in groups like that, what they talk about majorly is how long do you want to breastfeed your child? We want to do exclusive breastfeeding, things like that. And those are fantastic, they are awesome, right? But I think that we should be able to take it a step further and talk about the mental health of the expecting mother, where we talk about how you felt last week, where you felt, how did you feel about throwing up frequently? How do you feel about adding weight? How do you feel about your husband? The fact that maybe for some of them you find it difficult having sex, for example. What are the questions going on in your mind? And then you get to share these experiences. Now, one thing that this would do is that it would help you understand that you're not alone, because by the time you share your experience and the other person shares their experience, and you realize that, I also felt this. And when I talked about the antenatal group where I got to talk about mental health issues, and the way that people were saying, yes, I felt this way too. And the one lady said, you know what? Even while they were trying to encourage me, my in-law, my mother-in-law was around, and she was helpful, but everything she did was wrong in the way I looked at it. And so even though they were trying to help her, she saw every help as, there's a problem here. You are not doing it right. This is happening here. This is wrong. And of course, they won't understand this. They will feel like she's ungrateful. What kind of evil woman is this? What kind of evil woman have you married? And sometimes the husband even starts to look at, maybe there's a problem with my wife. But what they don't know is that there's a challenge she's going through at that point, because her body is still trying to balance up the chemicals, is still trying to adjust to physiologically, and she's also struggling with that at that point. And so, but if you have a support group where you are all going through the same thing and you can all share your experiences, and then maybe you then have a professional in that group who is able to then give you solutions, and so a support group would be a way to go. And I also feel it's because some people complain about the cost of therapy, and I think it's a good way to go, that if hospitals can incorporate this in their antenatal plan, right, where you have support groups, and support groups are not, they're usually a small group of 6 to 12, all right? There are some apps that do this, where you can just be part of a community, and they help you monitor your progress, and then tell you what to expect by stages, right? And so this has made a lot of women who have taken advantage of some of these apps, it has made it quite easy for them. But I would also advise, because we're a social being as humans, it will be important that if we can get that community, that social community where, mothers at different stages. So you could have the first trimester, second trimester, and then even after delivery, where we can come together and share our experiences, right? And so, like I mentioned earlier, that sometimes when mothers share their experiences, they omit a lot of the details. And you might not totally blame them. Why? Because the brain tries as much as well to omit details when it has experience, especially traumatic experiences, because that is something that pregnant women or mothers, nursing mothers experience, the trauma of the pain. And I've heard this a number of times, right? A number of times. So, for example, some women will say to me that when my husband mentions sex, for example, I shake, I feel traumatized, right? When they even want to talk about the experience, some of them would say, don't talk about it, don't talk about it. And that's because it wasn't easy for them. It was traumatic for them. And so for some of them would say that when they are talking about it, their body starts to experience the same pain or similar pain that they felt that day. And so this helps us understand that the birthing experience is a traumatic one for a lot of women, right? And so even though being pregnant and having a child is a wonderful experience, it also comes with its own challenges. It's mental health challenges, like I've mentioned, depression, anxiety, and even post-traumatic stress, depending on, and the severity depends on the nature of births that you had, CS, epidural, whatever the process is for you, could leave its own taste of trauma. Right, it's important for us to understand that these things will not, for some of them, doesn't last forever, right? But having that avenue where you can talk about it, where you can share your experience, helps deal with it. It helps deal with it. Sharing your experience helps deal with it. And that's why you find that when people share their birthing experience in detail, others can relate with it. And it can, like I mentioned, it can help them feel like they are not alone. Even sharing your experience, when you talk about the experiences, it also equips you to being able to solve the problems. Why? Because the human mind, when we are faced with challenges, we become overwhelmed by the challenges that we're not able to process them rationally. And that's why you find that. So we had an experience sometime where a couple were having issues, towards a particular time of the year. They will always have conflicts. But they didn't know why, and finally came for therapy. And then in therapy, they realized that, so the therapist asked that what happens during this period, and they realized that both in-laws are always around during this period, and they don't get along. But what that does is that it leaves the conflict with the couple. But this has been happening for years, and they could not solve the problem. Why? Because when we are faced with challenges, we feel overwhelmed. And so in therapy, but when therapist asked them, what do you think the solution will be? And they said, okay, you know what, let's change the timing. So one family would visit at this time, and the other family would visit at another time. And honestly, something as simple as this solved the conflict. But the question is, why couldn't they solve this on their own? Why? Because when we are faced with challenges, we feel so overwhelmed. But when we talk about it, our mind starts to look at it from a third person's perspective, and it becomes easier for us to solve these problems. This is why you also notice that when a friend comes to you with their challenges, you are able to advise them adequately. You give them advice, and it looks like you've become a coach or something like that. But when you are in that same challenge, it looks like you are helpless and you cannot do anything about it. Why? Because your mind at that point is affected by the emotions you're feeling. And so I think that if we can apply some of these things, it would go a long way to helping pregnant women as well as nursing mothers cope with the difficulties of childbirth or the birthing experience. Thank you.